Good afternoon. Welcome. I'm Jeremy Loeffler. I work in the Policy Office in the Division of Institution and Award Support here at the National Science Foundation, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to another session of our Fall 2024 NSF Virtual Grants Conference. I am now pleased to turn over this session to our presenters who are going to cover the merit review process at NSF.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the merit review session of the Fall 2024 NSF Virtual Grants Conference. I'm Nigel Sharp, Program Officer at NSF for more than 20 years, and I'm here with my colleagues Randy Phelps, currently in the Office of Integrative Activities, and Marina Mazor from our Office of the General Counsel to give you this session and answer your questions. So without further ado, we'll see what we're discussing today, which is basically what you need to know to get a proposal into us that's acceptable and looks like it has a good chance of support. And we're going to discuss what we do with that proposal when it comes in so that you have some idea of what we're doing while we're not talking to you. So we'll be discussing the review criteria in particular and encouraging you to become a reviewer. And the mantra, which is the last line on this slide, ask early, ask often. People often are reluctant to contact a program officer because they think they're bothering us. But quite honestly, we'd rather be bothered in advance than have to do something about it afterwards. So it's much better if you ask us. It really is part of our job to help you ask us for funding the way that is most likely for you to succeed. So please ask early, ask often. Any issues, we don't mind answering questions. So the first thing to consider is the timeline through a review process. The top left pieces aren't quite as relevant because, of course, you will already have looked at an opportunity, I suspect, and gone through proposal preparation, following along with the Policies and Procedures Guide. So the proposal comes in to NSF through research.gov and grants.gov, two routes. And the first thing that happens is it goes to a program officer. You will be able to see program officer assigned to your proposal if you go look in whichever platform you use to submit it and ask for a status. We then go through this perhaps long but essential review process, and we'll be talking about that as we go forward. So let me just start with the perhaps obvious things. We say this regularly, and it's fascinating to me how many people appear not to have done what it says here. And firstly, read the funding opportunity. You know, the solicitation comes out, the dear colleague letter comes out, the proposal, program description comes out, in the various ways that we announce funding opportunities. And it is interesting to me to see sometimes where it's like, I'm sorry, did you read where in paragraph 3 it said? So it's important. I always felt, early on, I felt, why on earth are we telling people that? Isn't it obvious? Well, we're telling people because apparently it isn't as obvious as we expected. And then you get this first thing, ask for clarification. I would be the first person to admit that NSF paperwork is not a model of concise clarity. Nevertheless, it does contain the information you need. It's often repetitive so that you don't have to read every piece, but you can see that there's a reiteration of a point that we thought was important appears later on. There's usually program officers, more than one identified, and you're usually welcome to contact any of them. Usually you start with the lead, or you can start with all of us. One thing I recommend you don't do is send separate emails to all the people listed in an opportunity, because we do all talk to each other and we will pass things around. Secondly, in the proposal, please address all the review criteria. There are two primary criteria, which we'll be talking about, the intellectual merit and broader impact criteria, but specific solicitations have other criteria. You should make sure you address them all. Third bullet here, well, that's why we're here, to help you to understand it. Fourth bullet, omissions and mistakes. We generally recommend, please, do not get up close to the deadline, because that's when people start making mistakes. I've had plenty of proposals that include text like, according to insert reference here, where they never got back and cleaned up that note to themselves. And then, of course, completion. If you actually submit a proposal, I always recommend that you download the proposal back to your local institution from our system and have a quick look at it to make sure that what we got here is in fact what you think you submitted. We have had cases where a section turned out to have been submitted under a different section title. So we get two copies of one document instead of two separate documents. So check that it's complete. The NSF systems now, research&grants.gov, they actually do a lot more checking than they used to. And so a lot of these things cannot be submitted. This can be very embarrassing and very irritating when you get towards the end and you press the submit and suddenly it says, oh, wait a minute, you haven't done this, or this file isn't adequate, or there's a peculiar error in this. That's can be very galling if you're up close to the deadline and you don't have time to fix the problem. So check, recheck, ask, recheck, ask, and please don't press up to the deadline. So how does this happen? You have submitted to an opportunity that goes into the system and goes to one of our program officers and therefore goes to staff, program officers, program director, and terminology is interchangeable, program staff, program assistants, financial analysts. We have a wide range of staff, many of whom will look at a proposal when it first arrives. And of course, what we're checking is that the proposal is indeed complete, that it's within the deadline, that it's appropriate and conformal. So it actually meets the requirements. We have the option to return a proposal without review. Most of us are very reluctant to do that because we appreciate how much work has gone into preparing a proposal. And so it's really hard, particularly for me, to send back a proposal without review because it didn't meet the requirements. So make sure yours does. If the proposal's outside the scope, and sometimes the boundaries between programs are not clear, which is part of the earlier point, ask early and ask often. If you're not sure, ask us. We will discuss it with other program officers and try to find the most appropriate home for it. It's a fact that the boundaries in science are very fuzzy, that the boundaries in the NSF programs are fuzzy, and sometimes it's not obvious where to submit. But we will do our best to try and transfer it where it will get the best evaluation. And again, ask early, ask often. Please don't get tired of my saying that because I'm going to say it a lot. All right, so the Proposal and Award Policies and Procedures Guide is the Bible, but it's important to remember that this Bible is in fact modified by specific solicitations. And so there may be, in the solicitation to which you're applying, there may be a specific override of one or more of the requirements of the APPG. But if the solicitation does not address a criterion, then the PAPPG controls. All right, so as I said, We really try hard not to send something back without review. But the primary things that go wrong are that the sections aren't all there. The intellectual merit and broader impact, we've made modifications in the system to try and emphasize and make separate sections for submission and make sure that you do actually include all these pieces. But some people still manage to get it wrong. The summary requirement, I think, is much harder to get wrong these days, or the project description requirement is possible. So the results from prior support section also causes some confusion. The important thing there is to remember it's any award you received that has an end date in the past 5 years. It's any award on which you were the principal investigator or what we call the co-principal investigator. We don't have co-investigators with lesser status. NSF proposals, you're a PI, even if you're a co-PI. And anyone on the proposal in that category has to have at least a mention of results from prior support with an end date in the past 5 years, as it says here. And that includes things from which you didn't receive funding. If you were on the proposal, that counts. And of course, we have a complete record of all our awards, so we know which ones you were on. And that is, again, part of our checking. I would have to say that this is one of the commonest reasons why a proposal gets sent back, is because you didn't cover that full list. And again, ask early, ask often. If you're not sure if something should be included, ask us. We can check in the system to see what you're listed on that you have to report on. The reporting doesn't have to be very detailed, but it does have to be present. Data management and sharing, I expect you've read that. Postdoc mentoring, graduate student mentoring. Those mentoring plans are required if you're asking for funding for any of those categories. There's no penalty for including a mentoring document for a project that actually includes junior researchers of this sort, even if the specific proposal isn't asking for funding for them. It's required if you're asking for funding. It's not a mistake to include if you're not. Other issues, inappropriate. I always have some issue with this one because I think we should fund everything. Sorry, we should be able to fund everything, but that's not true. There are certain specific things that NSF does not fund. For example, research in outer space, which is the purview of NASA. There are some national security concerns that I'm not going to go over. We have a lead time requirement that if there isn't time for us to get money out before you need the money, we may simply decline to look it over just because we don't think we can get it through. Another reason for ask early, ask often. We have a number of preliminary proposal competitions where you have to submit a preliminary. It's important to understand which sort of solicitation you have. Some of them are mandatory, invite or do not invite. So if you get a do not invite response to a preliminary and you still submit a full, it'll be sent back. Some of the preliminary proposal systems have an encourage, discourage, which says we don't think this is going to be competitive, so don't submit, but you're not actually forbidden, not actually refused submission. The duplication can be in the eye of the beholder. Again, ask early, ask often. If you're thinking of submitting a proposal to more than one competition, for example, that can be acceptable depending upon the contents, because the review process, as you'll see, is context dependent. And so if you submit to one program, you will be reviewed in a different context of other proposals than if you submit to a different program. So it's not necessarily a mistake to submit a substantially similar proposal. Nevertheless, we don't We don't encourage it, and you should talk to program office. Duplicates, word for word duplicates, please don't do that. If you want us to consider a proposal in more than one program for more than one context, intellectual context, talk to us. We have ways to do that without you submitting more than one. So, how are we doing? Continuation, preparation requirements, page limitations, formatting. There's a list of these, and they're pretty simple. They mostly include the number of pages. Of course, we try to enforce a level playing field, which means nobody gets more space to describe their project. Formatting, we really don't like tiny fonts because they're hard to read, and they also suggest you're trying to pack in more information than is allowed. This is a tricky one, but nevertheless, please be careful, read the instructions, as we said before, and make sure you meet them. Funding opportunity, yes, people occasionally do submit to the wrong solicitation, the wrong funding opportunity. Again, ask early, ask often. But it is possible to have a misunderstanding. I was talking earlier about fuzzy boundaries and have something that doesn't fit and that we can't find a home for. I don't like that one, but it happens sometimes. Deadlines, it's very difficult now to submit after a deadline just because the systems are enforcing that more than they have. It's still possible. The substantial revision one is difficult. I tend to be the old softy on this, that I'm more inclined to accept a proposal that was turned down before, even if you can argue it wasn't substantially revised because it's being reviewed in a different context in a different year. Nevertheless, we have had a number of proposals sent back without even being updated, without even the references being updated, and letters of collaboration not updated, and those are we do tend to send back. Awarded, yes, you that's an odd one. I actually admit I don't think I've seen that one where we get a proposal for something we awarded already. And of course, the required sections, this is all part of the preparation requirements, the first one. That's essentially the same point. Read the solicitation, read the PPG, learn to say PPG, and make sure you've got everything required in there. So what do we look for in the proposals that we move forward to consideration for funding? Obviously, we're looking for quality. We're looking for the best science. We're looking for the most impactful science. We're looking for advancing knowledge. It does not have to be potentially transformative, the phrase we use to describe things that will revolutionize the field. There's a lot of very good research done on foundational topics. After all, it's hard to revolutionize something if you don't know what it is to start with. Nevertheless, we expect to see some advances in your field that would come about if we funded this project. We don't mind risky. We don't mind if it's high risk, high return. It's not essential to guarantee the advance, but it must have potential. And we have the societal goal criterion, the broader impact criterion. Intellectual merit, broader impact. There must be some contribution to societal goals. And you'll find people have different emphases there, which is another case of asking us, ask early, ask often. We do like to have evaluation criteria. We do like it if you have some form of metric whereby you're going to evaluate how well you've done in your project. For the intellectual merit part, that's relatively straightforward, publications and references and citations and so on. Broader impacts, it depends. We'll talk about this later, but broader impacts confuse a lot of people. They're very broad. And so the evaluation is going to be broad too. It depends what you're planning to do. We ask reviewers, as already discussed, to talk to those two primary criteria. We ask reviewers, what is it you're going to do? Why do you want to do it? Do you have a decent plan for doing it? Can you tell if you've succeeded or not? What will we get out of it? People sometimes say that in Hollywood, it's what have you done for me lately? We're actually stricter than that. What are you going to do for us next? So that's what you should be explaining so that reviewers understand it. Reviewers can look at it and go, oh, that's interesting. I want to know how this comes out. If you get that piece first, the review process will be much kinder to you. Of course, that requirement, that suggestion, applies to both criteria. Potential to advance knowledge, potential to benefit society. Specific outcomes, it's better if they're specific than generic. Proposals that talk about how they're going to inspire the entire community, the entire educational foundation, that's too generic, really. More specific, desired outcomes. We ask the reviewers to consider 5 elements in both criteria, 2 criteria, 5 elements. The potential, will it actually meet the 2 criteria? How original, how is it? How creative is it? Potentially transformative, obviously a good thing, but not essential. But how well does it do that? Does it have that promise? Is it well planned? That varies a bit depending upon the size of the project, scale, what you're planning to do, but does it have a plan that means it'll happen? And then, of course, are you qualified to do it? Do you have the resources to carry it out? There's a section in the proposal on other resources that you have available. And it's important that if you plan to use something that we're not being asked to fund, that you indicate clearly that you have access to it and that you can carry it out. These things are general elements. They're overarching criteria because, of course, these items depend critically on the field you're in and the sort of research you're planning to do and the size of your activity and so on. So think a bit about simple questions. Why this topic? Why now? And why you? So think to yourself, why this, why now, why me? That's a good start. And then when you've got through that, think, can I do it? Am I capable? Can I prove I'm capable? Do I have the resources? So we review things in different ways. We do like a lot to use panel reviews, partly because it gives us a cross comparison between proposals rather than evaluating a proposal in isolation. Some proposals do get evaluated that way by what we call ad hoc review only. We often use ad hoc reviews from people with a very specific expertise or technical expertise in the field to add to the benefits of a panel review, or to select a number of items to look at a proposal that has a wide range, where it might be difficult to assemble a panel of a reasonable size with expertise in everything. Because of this approach to reviews, it is important that your proposal should be understandable by more than just immediate, very precise experts in your same field. This goes to the point I just said in the pithy thing. Why this? Why this particular topic within the broader field you're working in? And so it's important that your proposal be understandable by people outside your specific sub-area. So broader scientific knowledge. We do reviews with in-person panelists. Obviously, we suspended that during the pandemic, but now it's coming back because we find the in-person discussions much more helpful. But there's often a remote person. I always think they're not virtual. They're real participants. They're just remote. But the language is virtual reviews. We may put it through multiple panels, especially if you are cutting across NSF themes. As I said, the boundaries are fuzzy. And so sometimes in order to address that fact, we'll review in more than one program, more than one panel. Where are we? Yes, okay. We can, in fact, review before or after a panel, ad hoc before, ad hoc after, particularly if a panel says, well, we don't really understand this point. We move forward. And then there's a separate category, which is less frequently used, which is internal review, program officers only. We'll do that for certain specific categories, in particular, the ones listed here with an acronym: rapid response, early concept, interdisciplinary. Supplemental requests are often reviewed internally only. You already have a grant, you plan to enhance it by some method, primarily undergraduate things, research experiences for undergraduates, supplements for a specific problem are often internally reviewed only. Again, if you're not sure what's going to happen, ask us. Ask early, ask often. How will my proposal be reviewed? You're welcome to ask us. We may not know at the time you ask us because we haven't decided, but ask. So that leaves this question that we often get, which is, well, you know, the people who reviewed my proposal, I'm not sure they knew what they were doing. In most cases, they do know what they're doing. They may not always explain it as clearly as you would like in their written reviews, but we do, I think, over the years, all the ones I've watched, we've done a pretty good job of getting reviewers with the necessary expertise. We often get reviewers with general expertise, with outreach expertise, with an emphasis on how to handle undergraduate teaching even. You know, because depending on what you're proposing to do, they will be able to evaluate how well you are addressing what you plan to do. We find reviewers in all sorts of ways. We have program officers coming in and out of the foundation regularly, people in active research who join us for a couple of years. We ask around, we talk to people. We look at conference proceedings. We look at professional society programs of who has been talking, who's been invited to give a speech. We look at all that. We use reviewers we've used before who have proven to be very good. We like when a proposal includes recommendations for reviewers because that helps us to expand our pool of expertise and knowledge. It's not really helpful to recommend all your collaborators because under NSF conflict of interest rules, which will come up in a minute, we can't use those for reviewers. So if you recommend all your collaborators, you might as well not recommend anyone. You are also welcome to send us emails suggesting that you want specific people to look at your proposal. We understand that some people don't like to put recommendations on record. You're also allowed, if not encouraged, to suggest reviewers that you think we shouldn't use for whatever reason. Ask early, ask often. And of course, we love volunteers. You want to come and review? Please come and review. We love to volunteers. Contact one of us. If you make a mistake and contact one of us with the wrong expertise, don't worry, we'll pass it on. We like volunteers. Contact us, go through it, look at it. Send us a CV and ask again. Sometimes we get volunteers and it turns out that in a specific program, they're conflicted with too many of the proposals under consideration, and therefore we can't use them. And we don't always remember to go back and tell people that communication was amusing. So that's a basic introduction to proposals, what they should contain, how we can best get them through review, and how we end up with reviews. And so now I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Randy Phelps, who is going to talk about what reviewers actually do for us. Randy.
Thank you, Nigel. As mentioned, my name is Randy Phelps. I'm a staff associate in the NSF Office of Integrative Activities, which resides in the Director's office. So I'm going to talk now for just a few slides before coming back at the end. But I will talk a little bit now about what is the role of the reviewer that you've heard about so far. And I'm going to point out the very last statement here. The basic summary is the role of the reviewer is to make independent written comments on the quality of the proposal content. And by proposal content, we mean, as these bullets suggest, the strengths and weaknesses of the two NSF merit review criteria. As Nigel mentioned, the intellectual merit and the broader impacts are what guide the review of all NSF proposals. So the strengths and weaknesses of those two criteria are important in the consideration of the review. Also, the adequacy of the proposed project plan, including the budget, resources, and timeline. Does the scope of the project, do the resources that are being brought to the project and the timeline, do they all make for a likelihood of success for the science that's being proposed? And also the priorities of the scientific field and of the NSF program. We bring in external experts as panelists, as Nigel mentioned, and as reviewers, because they are attuned to the goings-on in the field at that point in time. So we rely on their expertise to tell us which proposals are best aligned with the priorities of the scientific field, and also the potential risks and the benefits of the project. You may have heard that NSF is sometimes thought of as being risk averse because we go with things that are almost guaranteed of success. We don't encourage that. We want to make sure that we have potentially transformative research along the way, which sometimes involves risks. But there are risk mitigation plans that can go along with that. So it's all a single package to determine which is the best science, which is the best engineering research, and what is the likelihood of success and the ways in which potential risks might be mitigated. So that's the role of the reviewer. Specifically, we have reviewers that serve as panelists. So as Nigel mentioned, one of the advantages of having panels is that there is a lively discussion amongst all the participants in a panel, and they can cross-compare the various proposals that are before them and identify the strengths and weaknesses and identify which ones are potentially the most impactful for the U.S. science community. So discussing the proposal's strengths and weaknesses of the merit review criteria, we talked about that, and the solicitation-specific criteria with other panelists. As Nigel mentioned, the solicitation often has very specific criteria that exceed what might be found in the PAP guide. I refer to it as the PAP guide. Some refer to it as the PPG. But the solicitation has a lot of information there to guide reviewers to determine which are the proposals that NSF should fund or recommend that NSF funds. We'll come back to that in just a moment. And basically, during a panel, everybody contributes to the writing of a summary of the discussion that occurred during the panel. Also then, the panel reviewers will provide some indication of the relative merits of the different proposals, as I already alluded to. And it's important here, and this should be bold-faced in my opinion, is that reviewers, whether they're on panels or whether they are ad hoc reviewers, as Nigel mentioned, they do not make funding recommendations or decisions. They make recommendations to NSF and specifically to the program officers who are convening panels or soliciting the reviews for the various proposals. But it's not, as you will hear, it's not the NSF program officers that make recommendations or funding decisions. They do make recommendations, but they make recommendations to their division directors or their office heads. And it then follows a standard process whereby the division directors or the office heads will sign off, and then those proposal recommendations go to our division of grants and agreements, which is where the actual award decisions are made. So it's a long and somewhat cumbersome process, but it's a very thorough process. And I think that's an important point to convey to the community to make sure that they understand that this does take a long time, but it takes a long time for the review process because it is a very thorough process and a fair one. We strive to be very fair and rigorous in our recommendations for award funding. So after all of that, why would you want to serve as an NSF reviewer? And I think you will find almost universally at NSF, if someone says, how do I learn how to write a good proposal or a competitive proposal? One of the first things that you will be told is to serve as an NSF reviewer. And the reason for that is it gives you a chance to gain firsthand knowledge of the merit review process. Nigel mentioned, of course, the intellectual merit and the broader impacts. How do those two balance each other out in a discussion of the merits for funding? You get a good sense of that as a panelist in particular. If you get to see how various proposals balance the intellectual merit and the broader impacts, as well as the solicitation criteria. There's no better way to gain that knowledge than serving as a panelist, or at least as a reviewer ad hoc, is one way to also get a sense of how that might play out. And also to learn about common problems with proposals. One thing that we are often asked, and as I mentioned, how do I write a good proposal? It's very difficult to say how to write a good proposal. It's easier to say how to write a less compelling proposal. And one of the reasons for doing that is basically to just say that if your proposal is technically flawless, and everybody strives to have that happen, it may not read as a compelling proposal. So reviewers, how they react to your proposal or proposals, not your proposal if you're serving as a reviewer, but how reviewers react to technically flawless but not necessarily compelling proposals is very insightful for you to see. And also discover, as I said, just proposal writing strategies. I often say that you as a PI are often writing proposals to convince somebody of something, but you don't often think like a reviewer to see whether or not what has been written is something that is compelling, as I mentioned before, and is what you want to hear as a story for why this proposal should be funded over other proposals that a panel or reviewers might be considering. And also, it's a good socializing event to meet colleagues and NSF program officers managing the programs related to your research. So I'm going to hand it off to my colleague Marina to talk a little bit about conflicts, and then I'm going to come back in a few more slides to close out this session. So thank you.
Thank you, Randy. My name is Marina Mazor, and I'm an ethics attorney in NSF's Office of the General Counsel. We are going to talk now about conflicts of interest and how we manage these through the review process. So first, why do we care? Why do we care about identifying and managing conflicts? The primary purpose of our conflicts process is to make sure that there's no bias or even appearance of bias based on a panelist's affiliations with institutions or with individuals that could then affect that panelist review. We want to ensure that the only aspect of a proposal that impact the review are the two merit review criteria that you've been hearing about, intellectual merit and broader impacts. Now, the second purpose is to accomplish the broader goal of preserving the trust of the public, of the scientific community, and of Congress in the integrity of our work. It is absolutely critical that we ensure fairness in our process and that we're responsible stewards of taxpayer dollars. We want to make sure that all of the work we do is above reproach. So ideally, for every panel, we would have a whole group of reviewers who've never met anyone who's ever submitted a proposal, who had no knowledge, no affiliation with any institution that submitted a proposal. But that's just not how it works in real life. In the real world, the scientific community, as you all know, can be very, very small. Sometimes there are 24 people on the planet who know about a particular area of science and who might be qualified to review and work in that area. So the way we manage this is we look at laws and regulations that exist that define the types of institutional affiliations and the types of personal affiliations that can create conflicts. Most of these apply government-wide, and we also have some that are very specific just to NSF. So under the law, like I said, there are certain institutional and personal affiliations that create conflicts. What does this mean for you? It means that if you have submitted a proposal, people who have disqualifying institutional relationships and disqualifying personal relationships will not be reviewing your proposal. There's an asterisk to this that I'll get to in a moment where there are times when we can issue a waiver. And this is to ensure that the only things influencing the review of your proposal are the merit review criteria. And what does this mean for you if you're a reviewer? If you're a reviewer, it means that if you have certain relationships with an institution or a person who's involved in a proposal, you have a conflict. You can't review that proposal, and depending on the type of conflict, you might not even be able to serve on the panel. The institution or the person doesn't need to be the lead on the proposal, they just have to be named somewhere. And if it's a potential financial conflict, for example, if the panelist home institution is going to get money under the proposal, you can't even serve on the panel that is considering the proposal. Now, for some types of personal and professional relationships or affiliations that create conflicts, we can issue a waiver that would allow you to review the proposal. This happens in our regulatory conflicts. It never happens with the financial conflicts. And if we are going to issue a waiver, you have to go through NSF for that. You can never make a decision yourself about a waiver. Now, this slide shows examples of the types of affiliations with an institution involved in a proposal that can create conflicts, or that do create conflicts. Now, most of these, but not all of them, come under the criminal financial conflict of interest statute. And that means they present a full stop. Can't review the proposal, you can't serve on the panel, and we can't waive the conflict. And that means that people with these types of institutional affiliations also won't be reviewing your proposals. So, for example, if you are a professor at a university, you have a conflict with your university, and you can't review a proposal involving your university. We call that a home institution conflict. And if you have submitted a proposal, a professor at your university won't be reviewing it. You also can't review a proposal for an institution where you hold some other type of paid position, for example, if you're ad hoc faculty or if you're a consultant. You can't review a proposal if you're seeking or negotiating for a job with an institution that is named in that proposal. And the seeking doesn't have to be formal. As soon as you send an application or you start talking to someone about employment, you have a conflict. You also have a conflict if you're on a board of directors, if you're an officer, or if you hold any other kind of fiduciary position with an entity. And when that's the case, if the entity is named in your proposal, you can't review that proposal. So on this slide, we're going to talk about examples of the types of personal and professional relationships that also create conflicts. Many of these, but definitely not all of them, are what we call impartiality or appearance conflicts. Those conflicts arise under regulations and not under a statute. And by definition, what this means when these types of conflicts arise is you can't review the proposal, but you can still serve on the panel. And in some circumstances, we can waive the conflict. This also means if you submitted a proposal, someone with these relationships can't be reviewing your proposal, except in limited circumstances where we've issued a waiver. So looking at the types of conflicts listed on the slide, you have a conflict with your close personal friends and your close family members. You can't review each other's proposals. And if the person is your spouse or your child, we can't waive the conflict. That's a financial conflict, one of the ones that we can't waive, and that's where you can't serve on the panel. And the same goes for your business partner, for example, someone you have a company with. Another example, and this is NSF specific, is you have a lifetime conflict with your thesis advisor and your thesis students. What this means is you can't review a proposal from these individuals, and they can't be reviewing your proposals. You also have a 4-year conflict with your collaborators and with your co-authors. This means if you have formally collaborated with someone, you can't review each other's proposals for 4 years. This is an area where we can sometimes issue a waiver. And finally, you have a 2-year conflict with your co-editors. Now, if you have a question about a conflict, either because you're a PI who've submitted something or you're a prospective or current reviewer, please reach out to your cognizant NSF program officer and they'll be able to provide you with further guidance. We at NSF work very, very hard up front to make sure that no one with a conflict participates in a review. But sometimes we learn about a conflict later in the process. So what do we do in those cases? If we find out someone had a conflict and they reviewed a proposal, but this is happening before a panel takes place, we don't consider that review in our analysis. We could then get additional reviews to make sure that we have an appropriate number of reviews, or we might have the proposal reviewed from scratch. Now, if someone served on a panel and we later find out that they had a financial conflict, we may have to discard the work of the entire panel and just start from scratch. This is a worst case scenario, but it has happened before. So the takeaway from all this is that individuals who serve on panels need to disclose and be very transparent upfront about all of their relationships and affiliations when they sign up to review. And when you're in the process of reviewing, if something comes up, you need to stop immediately, talk to your program officer, and they will contact ethics as needed. It's important to remember you can't just charge ahead and think, it'll be fine, I can be impartial. A lot of people, everyone will promise that they can be impartial, and you're all good people, and I'm sure everyone is trying to be impartial. But unfortunately, that is not the legal standard when you're reviewing. And it's also not the legal standard when someone is reviewing your proposal. And on a final note, it's important to know that all the conflicts rules I just talked about, they don't just apply to reviewers, they apply to all NSF employees in all of our work. And now I will turn the presentation back over to Randy. Thank you.
Thank you, Marina. So now I'll talk a little bit more about the funding decisions and how they're made. And I've already alluded to this in the previous section. Basically, the merit review of the panel or the ad hoc reviewers, they provide review of the proposals and advice on the funding and feedback on the strengths and weaknesses to the proposers. That is information that is provided to them. But it's important to note that the reviews are advisory to the NSF Program Officer. And those reviews are taken in total for the program officers to develop a portfolio of awards from the program that they are considering at the time. But the NSF Program Officer is not the one that makes the award decisions. The program office makes award recommendations to their division directors or office heads, as I mentioned earlier. And they are the ones that can either reject the funding recommendations or concur on those funding recommendations. And just as an example for those of you who have submitted proposals to NSF, you are familiar with the fact that basically the reviewers can provide ratings. They don't necessarily have to provide a rating, but the ratings tend to be either excellent, very good, good, fair, or poor, and in some cases, some combination of those if they fall in between. So those are the ratings that are provided, as well as in many cases, or most cases, a description of what the reviewer thought about the intellectual merit, the broader impacts, and the review criteria in the solicitation. So the reviews provide an analysis of how well the proposal addresses both of those review criteria, as I mentioned, and generally in the context of the strengths and the weaknesses of the proposal. And then a reason for a potential recommendation for declination if that's applicable. And as usual, Nigel mentioned it, ask early, ask often. If you have any questions, the source of contact, the point of contact is your cognizant program officer. So the documentation is a verbatim of what happened during the panel reviews or the reviews themselves, with the possible exclusion of reviewer with exclusion of reviewer identities and potentially unwarranted comments that might be redacted, but that's a very, very rare occasion. So you will almost always get reviewer the reviews, and if there was a panel summary or summaries, if the panel was reviewed in more than one panel, you'll get those as well. But again, they are verbatim. And a process statement, how the review was undertaken, is something that is also provided so that you have context for how the proposal was reviewed. It used to be called a context statement, and it was changed to a process statement several years ago. And also, there's an option for the program officer to provide what are called PO comments that provide some explanation for why a proposal might have been awarded, although in most cases, if PIs receive an award, they don't care why it was awarded. That's not the right attitude, by the way. You should always care why your proposal was awarded if it was, but perhaps more significantly, if your proposal was declined, why that might be the case, why it was declined. And the examples of why a proposal might be declined are listed here. Some of the examples, there are more than these, but this gives you a sense. One was, I've already mentioned whether or not the proposal was technically flawless, but not necessarily compelling, especially compared to other proposals that are being reviewed in the program. It was not considered to be competitive. That's a different question based on the merit review criteria, and the program office actually concurred, program officer concurred on that. There are proposals that just don't fit very well within what NSF typically funds. Nigel mentioned that he thinks that we should fund basically everything should be fundable, but in many cases, NSF has a certain niche role in the federal government, and we try to not duplicate some of the efforts of our sister agencies across the U.S. government. Also, the proposal had flaws or issues that might have been identified by the program officer, might be a reason for being declined. That is also the case that there may be some fundamental reasons why a proposal might not be funded because it had what were considered to be serious flaws. It might not be doable in the context of what the PI had proposed. Also, this is an important one, that the program portfolio has to be balanced across many dimensions. We've talked a lot already about the intellectual merit and the broader impacts. Those play off against each other in some ways. You have to balance what the intellectual merit is and whether or not the PI took seriously the broader impacts as part of the project that they're proposing. And what is the balance amongst the intellectual merit, the science, the broader impacts, such as the geography? NSF strives to avoid undue concentration of its awards all within one particular state, for example. You might want to balance it out across geography. I hate that word small versus large institutions, under-resourced institutions, we can call them. Some institutions that are referred to as small may have 30,000 students, and they're not necessarily small, but they are under-resourced in terms of doing scientific research. And in fact, their primary goal may not be as a research institution, so that they may have small amounts of research funding. So providing opportunities for those institutions to expand their scientific research is one factor that we might will consider. And there are other factors as well to create what we've referred to as a portfolio balance. So other points to consider when you are revising and submitting. So for example, say your proposal was declined and you want to resubmit it to the next competition. I coordinate the Major Research Instrumentation Program at NSF, which occurs every year. And if you do get a proposal that's declined, you may want to resubmit it for the next competitions. So you have to consider a number of things when you do the resubmissions. Do the reviewers and NSF program officers not just say why a proposal was declined, but are there significant strengths that are also highlighted within your proposals that you can build upon? Also, if there are weaknesses, can you address the weaknesses that reviewers and program officers identified? And one thing that is not well appreciated, but not only can you address the weaknesses in a proposal revision, resubmission, but how do you address those weaknesses? Many people will ask, is there a section at the front of the proposal where I can say how I address the reviewer's comments from the prior competition? I have heard anecdotally that many reviewers do not like that approach because they don't want to be told what the previous reviewers had said and whether or not they are supposed to, as the new reviewers, somehow check the box saying that they did all those revisions. On the other hand, other program officers have told me that that's what they recommend for how to revise a proposal resubmission. It varies amongst the various cultures at NSF, and that's one thing you probably have heard about or will hear about, is that NSF covers a wide span of research in the scientific disciplines. And I'm an astronomer, as Nigel is as well, but we have a different culture than they do in the biosciences, for example, or engineering. So it's important, as you have heard before, to ask often and contact your program officers. Ask them how that particular discipline should address these weaknesses that the reviewers might have highlighted. And also then, are there other ways that you or your colleagues think you could strengthen a resubmission? And I've already addressed the fact that you should think not just as a writer of a proposal, but think about what you as a reviewer would think about if you were looking at your particular proposal. So say, for example, that your proposal was declined and you've talked to your program officer to find out why it was declined and you are not satisfied. NSF does have a reconsideration process, and it's explained here in a simple form, where the first step is to get an explanation from your program officer and or the division director. They are your first lines of explanation as to why a proposal might be declined. If you are still not satisfied, there is another process, another step in the process where you can get where you provide a written request for reconsideration to the assistant director. And you probably heard about the organization chart at NSF, but the assistant director are the folks who are in charge of the various directorates, for research directorates, for example, within 90 days of the decision. And it's important to note that this reconsideration process is not just, I don't like the answer that I got from my reviews, that I don't agree that something they said was true or not. Basically, the reconsideration process is about whether or not the process of the review was fair. So that is what the reconsideration process tries to establish. So the second step was the written request to the assistant director for reconsideration within 90 days of the decision. But then if you are still not satisfied, the institution, the organization can request reconsideration from the deputy director of NSF within 60 days of the decision. Reconsiderations tend to be rare, but it is important to note, again, it is about the process of the review. It's not about whether or not you agree with the outcome of the review, but it is a process that you need to be aware of in case there really is deep satisfaction with the way in which a proposal was reviewed at NSF. And also possible considerations for funding a competitive proposal. Let's be a little bit more on the optimistic side here. Proposals, for example, and the bullets are all here, but addresses the criteria, provides a compelling response. And I use that word a lot in my explanations for proposals. It addresses all review criteria in a compelling way. It has likely high impact, and it has, as part of the efforts, serious efforts at broadening participation of all aspects of the project participation. It has educational impact. It has an impact on an institutional state. It has a regional impact, is basically what that is saying in some ways. It has special programmatic considerations. It fits the solicitation very well, the goals of the solicitation very well. And there are some highlight priority items, if you will, priority areas, early career investigators, research at undergraduate institutions. I mentioned my aversion to small institutions because those institutions may be underserved, but they may be not research focused, and they may still be large, but they may be primarily catering to undergraduates. And then EPSCoR, for those of you who are in EPSCoR jurisdictions, I'm sure you know about that, but EPSCoR is the established program to stimulate competitive research to ensure that all geographic entities in the United States, states and commonwealths and territories are able to participate in NSF funding opportunities. And then whether or not you have other support for the PI, the current and pending support, you'll hear a lot about during this grants conference, so I won't go into that. And this is a good phrase, launching versus maintaining. The NSF's mantra used to be, or maybe still is, I'm actually not sure, where discoveries begin. So launching is something that is really critically important, getting good ideas off the ground versus doing the same thing year after year after year. That may have some criteria that the reviewers will look at as well. That's not to say that doing long-term research isn't a good thing, and it may well be a very critically important thing. And as I mentioned, I'm an astronomer, as is Nigel, but looking for the Hubble constant led to some really great discoveries on dark energy, and that was a very long-term process. And also, I've already mentioned things like the portfolio balance. So the issuing of the award, and I've already mentioned this, it is the reviewers who will make a recommendation to the program officer. Program officer makes a recommendation to the division director or the office head, and upon concurrence, the recommendations go to our Division of Grants and Agreements. And it's DGA that has the authority to make the awards, and DGA review and processing can take up to 30 days. There's a small cadre of folks down there in the building compared to where I sit anyway, or used to sit before working remotely. DGA has a small group of people that have to award all of the awards that NSF makes. So they're kind of overwhelmed, especially toward the end of the fiscal year. So it does take a little bit of time as well in that time frame that we talked about earlier in this presentation. So there are reasons why the grants officer will be able to make an award, and conversely, if these things don't apply, then it makes it more difficult to get an award out the door, or maybe even impossible. Number one, the institution has an inadequate grants management capacity. So that is about your institution. It's not you as a PI, and it is critically important for an award to be able to be managed at the institution level. And one thing that is important to note, and you may have heard of it, but it's important to note that NSF makes awards to institutions, not to individuals. So also, this is one of the things that is the bane of a program officer at NSF. When you go to make an award recommendation and you find that the PI or co-PIs have an overdue annual or final report. If that's the case, an award cannot be made. So keep up to date on your annual or final report due dates. Also, have to make sure that there are no outstanding issues with the institution as a PI. The PIs and co-PIs do not have any overdue project reports, or that they are even collaborating on. So some of those things I already mentioned there. So for more information, there is a website, www.nsf.gov. Please take a look at it early. Don't wait until you're ready to submit a proposal before you go and look at the NSF website. There's an awful lot of information there, an awful lot of good information there, but it's often hard to find, often hard to remember where it was when you found it the first time. So make sure that you take a look at it well before you are planning to write a proposal. The same is true of the PAP guide, the PAPPG. There are documents that you just need to be aware of, especially if you're new to writing proposals for the National Science Foundation. And as been mentioned repeatedly during this presentation even, contact the program officer. That is why we are here. Sometimes we are rather busy. It's hard for us to answer the phone the first time, or you answer an email the first time, and if it rolls off the screen, it's often hard to find it as you go along. So as Nigel has mentioned, and everyone here will mention, ask early and ask often. There are a number of different ways to find information from NSF, and the easiest way is to ask about that. So I will leave it there, and thank you for attending this session on the merit review process. And I wish you well for the remaining portion of the grants conference, and thank my colleagues here as well as our staff behind the scenes who could not have, we could not have done this without their great assistance, especially Jeremy Leffler. I will point that out. So thank you again, and best wishes.
Well, thank you, Randy, and Nigel and Marina. I'd like to welcome you all back. We still have a little bit of time where we can answer some questions, and thank you all for taking the time to answer some of those questions that are in the Q&A right now. So if you want to take a look at the responses that we've been typing in over the course of the past hour or so, please do that. I did want to pose a few questions to you. And if you're thinking of questions, you can still put them into the Q&A and we will get to them. And some of these questions are things that you may have answered already, but I thought they were worth bringing up again and talking a little bit more about, especially, with perhaps some of your personal experience working with NSF proposals for such a long time. So the first question that I have is that, we received a question asking whether NSF uses a point system for the review criteria. And Nigel responded to this in the Q&A, but could you talk a little bit about how the programs you oversee review and rank proposals?
Well, not easily, because my programs, I have so many different programs that do it different ways. We have some review processes where people do literally assign points, and then they come out with a numerical score, and then they recommend in that direction. But most of our programs, I would have to say, go by the intent, go by the discussion, go by the wording. The problem with a numerical system is, as I'm sure you're aware, some people are hard graders and some people are soft. And so there are some people who use the top end of the review scale and some who use the bottom. And so to get a proper comparison, a straight numerical average is not really valid.
I'd like to chime in too, because it does differ depending on institution type. So if you use a point scale, that's hard to establish. So it's the overall intellectual merit and broader impacts, and how you balance those depends in part on the institution. As I mentioned in my presentation, my portion of the presentation, there are institutions like the California State University system where research is not their primary goal. So the intellectual merit, they might have great broader impacts, and how you balance those is something that the panels in particular do a good job in establishing, but without a point system.
Okay, and then I guess a related question is, are there review criteria that are weighted more heavily than others? Does it vary by program? Perhaps, and I know this was touched on a bit early on, but perhaps you could add a little bit more detail about that.
I don't know, Randy, you want to take that one? Or
I was going to point to you, Nigel.
Oh, all right. Again, it depends what we're doing. We have portfolio balance issues where we try to pay attention to funding early career and established researchers, to funding research universities and teaching universities. We do pay attention to all the criteria. And sometimes that means that we will weight some review aspect more than another. We get directives from Congress, from the President's office, from our own upper management that perhaps give an emphasis in certain areas. We have early career emphases at the moment, and we have some artificial intelligence emphases going on, which are a bit difficult to explain. I'm obviously not intelligent enough, either naturally or artificially, to explain that. So, it's another, I'm afraid I had to answer several questions with the "it depends." The famous lawyer's answer, it depends. Different programs do things different ways. I've said this before, you have to understand, NSF is not a monolithic organization. It's a building full of iconoclastic individuals. And so there are considerable variations, and emphasis of review criteria is one of them. If you know the rough area you're likely to submit a proposal to, ask the people in that area.
And I'll just add briefly that I used the word portfolio, the phrase portfolio balance, and that's something that NSF really strives to do in its awards.
Okay, you talked a little bit about the part of the proposal where you can suggest reviewers to include or not include. If you're providing a list of reviewers not to include, do you need to provide a reason for why those reviewers should not be reviewing the proposal? And then a second question to that is, does it impact your proposal if you do not suggest reviewers?
Well, it doesn't impact the proposal at all. It's fun to suggest reviewers because sometimes it's helpful to expand our reviewer pool. we get suggestions from proposers. It doesn't do you any good to suggest people who are going to be conflicted, and the conflict rules are discussed in the PAPPG. It does help us if you suggest reviewers, but you're not required to, and it doesn't impact the review. And you don't have to give any reasons. Although some of my greatest amusements here have come from reading the reasons that some people give when they suggest reviewers. I won't give examples. You're not required to. You can just list, suggested, use these reviewers, do not use these other reviewers. And if there is a particular problem with a previous review, you can ask us, please do not use the previous reviewer who said X or some such criterion if you feel that they were really, really bad in any way. We do not guarantee to honor those requests, either positive or negative.
Yes.
That's a judgment that we will carry out. We generally will try not to use people you don't want us to use, but we can't promise that that's true.
Yeah, two thoughts occurred to me. One is, please make sure that if you do provide a list of either reviewers to use or not to use, that it is a single copy document, because that is what NSF only sees. I have seen those kind of documents in the supplemental documents, and that is something that you don't want. You don't want the reviewer community to see that list. So we will remove that, but it's an added step. And the other thing is simply that, as I mentioned, I coordinate the Major Research Instrumentation Program, which is inherently a cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary program. But they are typically reviewed within a single division, although we can co-review across various divisions, and we do, but it's more challenging. And one thing that the list of reviewers, suggested reviewers does is if you do use it, please provide reviewers across all the disciplines that might be impacted. That helps us to provide a better cross-disciplinary, multidisciplinary review of the proposal.
Great, thanks. The next question I have is, how do you manage the situation where reviewers might not have extensive knowledge in the areas that are submitted in proposals? How do they evaluate those such proposals, and how do you as a program officer manage that situation?
Well, we try not to use reviewers who don't have expertise. And as I said in the presentation, my experience over 22 years is that we've been pretty darn good, which is not to say we don't make mistakes. We are human. I realize that may come as a shock to some people, but program officers are human, and we do occasionally make mistakes. So what we try and do is, we try and pay attention to this. And if a reviewer clearly didn't understand something, or occasionally we get reviewers who actually say in their review, well, I'm not an expert on this, then we will go and we will look at the reviews. We will consider getting additional review and so on. So it's worth remembering that proposals are judged in a context which is not very narrow. It's often quite broad. So your proposal does need to be comprehensible to more than just very specific experts. This tends to be a significant problem in mathematics, for example, where some of the fields are very specialized. But your proposal should not be so obscure as to be incomprehensible to someone in the broader field.
And then I just will add, it's useful to think of reviewers in two different ways. One is a panel reviewer, and panels tend to be more general because they cover a wide range, 20, 30 proposals. So the expertise isn't going to exist for every proposal, but they are generalists, and you might think of them in that way. But if necessary, there are options to get ad hoc reviewers. And ad hoc reviewers tend to be people who have the distinctive expertise in a particular proposal. So it is the case that if a panel doesn't have the specific expertise, the program officer might request an ad hoc review or two to cover the specific expertise that is in the proposal.
The last question that I see here, and please, we do still have some time, so please continue to send some in if you still have questions, is the policy related to a PI that might be submitting a proposal to another federal agency for funding and to NSF. How do you, as a program officer, deal with a situation and even know about this type of situation? I see Nigel laughing. Never happens, right?
Well, here's a shock. Here's a shock for you. NSF program officers actually talk to program staff in other agencies. We have, I'm in astronomy, as Randy has mentioned. We regularly have meetings with NASA program officers. We have projects with the Department of Energy that I'm program officer on, and I talk to my DOE counterparts regularly. So we do actually talk to other agencies. There are legal restrictions related to privacy and confidentiality about what we can and cannot share with other agencies. If you look at the proposal to NSF, it does have a piece, a tick box for, has this proposal been submitted to another agency? And so we expect you to tell us, we expect you to put it in your current and pending support because it's pending. And if it's not quite submitted, that is, if the NSF deadline is before the other deadline, we expect you to put it under pending, as in pending submission. So we expect you to tell us. And then if you hear from the other agency, we expect you to tell us that. And we've done everything from co-funding something by my funding half of it and NASA funding the other half to, sharing it out and sending it across. I mean, there's a wide variety, but we do pay attention. As long as you tell us. If you don't tell us, we might not notice. If we do notice and you didn't tell us, you might get an nastygram. You might get an impolite email asking you why you didn't reveal this. But we try, not always successful.
Yeah, I will also just add, as I mentioned, I'm an astronomer, as is Nigel. But I coordinate the Major Research Instrumentation Program, which gets, a lot of proposals. And the big gorilla in the room for us in this program is the National Institutes of Health, where we do get proposals that seemingly belong more to NIH. And NIH has proposals that seemingly they think belong to NSF. So we have conversations with that agency in particular.
Okay, well, I see no further questions at the moment, so
we're good at passing the buck.
I do want to thank all of our panelists today for joining us and answering questions and presenting to all of you. I'm going to share again, just to save the date for our spring 2025 NSF Grants Conference, which will be in person, May 21st to 23rd in New Orleans. For those that are unable to join us in person, we also will have a virtual option available. So thank you all again, and we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.